Hello, and welcome to our weekly discussion about issues of importance to the Caucasus. I'm Joanne Lisosky, author and journalism educator. With me today, I'm lucky to have Paul A. Goble, former special advisor on Soviet issues to U.S. Secretary of State James Baker. Thank you for being here today, Paul.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about Turkey to begin with. And Turkey is quickly becoming now a leader on the world stage. It is now leading the NATO Very High Readiness Task Force. What impact will this have on Turkey's play on the world stage in general?
Well, I think Turkey is trying to figure out its place in the world. There have been so many changes that Turkey is exploring things. It seems to me that Turkey's testing the limits, if you will, seeing what the West will put up with, what others will put up with, and that this testing process is likely to go on for a while rather than leading to a complete break or to a return to the status quo ante. I would guess that we're going to be talking about Turkey testing this or that NATO limitation. Turkey's in the position where it has a very large army and a very important place that it's quite prepared to make use of, that controls an airfield that the United States and other NATO powers want to have access to at Incirlik. And so it's in a position to demand, shall we say, greater deference to what it wants than it did before. I think one of the things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that countries are asking questions which they probably always could have asked, but they assumed were off the table. Now I think Turkey feels, well, let's see what happens. And I think if they get slapped down hard, they'll back away. If they don't, they'll proceed in another way. I believe that with the incoming of a new American administration, which will be very, very interested in reviving NATO, which is, after all, the only structural link between the United States and Western Europe, that the United States will want to work with Turkey to make sure it stays within the alliance, but fully understanding that Turkey has a much larger role that's not limited by the NATO agenda. So, again, in my estimation, and I would be the last person to claim being an expert on Turkey, the Turks are testing the waters, and there will be, as there always is, when there's that kind of testing going on, some people who will extrapolate from that to the end of the world one way or another. So I would urge calm. I would suggest that this is just simply a kind of sumo wrestling match, and it'll be a while before we see anybody on the map.
Well, it seems that Turkey's support of Azerbaijan in the most recent war, the Second Karabakh War, it seems that their boosting of the Azerbaijan forces really told the world that Turkey is pretty facile in military operations. So what impact will this NATO leadership have on Turkey's influence throughout the region?
Well, Turkey is not only a player in Azerbaijan. Turkey is a player more broadly than that. It's becoming in the top 5 or 6 arms suppliers in the world. It has a major military-industrial complex that produces weapons that other people are buying, including, for example, Ukraine. So it's that. It is geographically in a terribly important place. I think that what NATO probably wants to see is to make sure that it isn't drawn into something that Turkey wants to do, but that the alliance doesn't want to do. And Turkey wants to make use of its being a member of the alliance as a kind of defensive shield that will allow it to promote its specific interests that may be larger or different than NATO's. I'm not certain that there would ever be a vote in Brussels on whether or not to adjust transit corridors in the South Caucasus. I just don't see that as part of the NATO agenda. On the other hand, NATO has an interest in beyond country, in a penumbral sense, stability. And so if what Turkey is doing promotes stability, then and promotes the interests of individual alliance members, but doesn't get the other members drawn into a conflict that could cause trouble elsewhere, then I suspect there'll be support, but not as active probably as some in Ankara would like.
I have just a little bit more question on what's happening in Turkey. The Turkish parliament approved the deployment of Turkish peacekeeping troops in Azerbaijan after Turkey and Russia signed an agreement establishing a joint center to monitor the ceasefire, the armistice. Turkish forces will be stationed at this security center for 1 year, according to this agreement. And how will this change? How will this, are we ready for Turkey to join the Russians in keeping peace in the Karabakh region?
Well, I don't think that's what's happening. I think that the Turks have their own interests, and the fact that the Turkish forces of any number are in Azerbaijan is a decision of the Baku government, not of Moscow. Azerbaijan wanted Turkish forces there not to work in league with the Russians against Azerbaijan, but as a balancing force against what the Russians might do. That there is an agreement between Ankara and Moscow on the details of putting together a monitoring station is no surprise, but that, please understand, the fact that there are Turkish troops in Azerbaijan is a decision of the Azerbaijani government and of the Turkish government. The accord between Ankara and Moscow is only over the modalities of how that's going to work in this center. If tomorrow or later today, Baku decided that it wanted to have a Turkish military base somewhere else in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan has a right as a sovereign country to do that. So it's important to understand that this is a kind of a two-step process. Azerbaijan wanted Turkey there to balance Russian influence, not to support Russian influence. That the Russians are going to do everything they can to try to get Turkey to do things that work in Russia's interest should come as no surprise. But that the Turkish forces are not in Azerbaijan because Moscow says they can be. They're in Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan says they can be. That's a huge difference, and I fear that some of the international media, which depends more on Russian materials than on Azeri or Turkish materials, is going to miss that. This is not Moscow. Moscow has no power, no right, no authority under international law to decide whether there will be Turkish troops in Azerbaijan. Only Azerbaijan has that right to agree if Turkey requests them or to make a request of Turkey. So it's not a Russian-Turkish concord against Azerbaijan. Those troops were there only because Azerbaijan has agreed to them. And that's I think, needs to be remembered by everyone talking about this.
That's a very good point. Thank you for clarifying that. There has been a great deal of discussion about the increase in the Russian troops in the Karabakh region. The armistice agreement signed November 10 was quite specific in its call for 1,960 peacekeeping troops from Russia, from the Russian Federation. Now there are reports that there are upward to 5,000 Russian military troops. That's according to Russian military sources, and they say it could reach 10,000. What do you think is behind this buildup?
Well, first off, what happened on November 10th was a declaration, not a full-fledged agreement. There were an awful lot of loose ends that were not tied. There were a lot of blank spaces that weren't filled in. The worst mistake any country that does well in a conflict can do is to, at the end of it, at what it imagines is the end of the conflict, to declare victory and look away. The Azerbaijanis, and with them the Turks, achieved a great deal in this in the second war. The November 10th armistice recognized a great deal, but it provided an awful lot of wiggle room for people who didn't want to play by the rules. I call this mission creep, that the Russians get so many people in there. What we know right now is that in addition to the 1960 Russian peacekeepers, there are also Russian construction workers of several hundred rebuilding various things. In the first instance, the Stepanakert airport. And I would argue that the opening of the Stepanakert airport to heavy military transit aircraft, which means that neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan has quite the same degree of control over what Moscow puts in there, is a very serious thing. No mention of that in the November 10th declaration, none at all. So the Russians are going ahead with it. That's several hundred more. In addition, Russians have been talking about 4,500 border guards, FSB border guards from the Russian secret police, if you will, that will be involved in guarding corridors, both the one between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan and across Nakhchivan between Armenia and Iran. That's a lot of people. In addition, there is, of course, the Russian military base at Gyumri, which presumably could have upwards of 10,000 soldiers if Moscow chooses to put them there. So what a lot of people in Baku thought was an unalloyed victory, the Russians are exploiting to put an awful lot of Russian forces in there. I've been saying since November 11th, this is not an agreement. An agreement is pages and pages and pages long, specifying all kinds of contingencies. What happened was a declaration that made a lot of people happy, that led to a victory parade in Baku, but it's a victory that can be stolen. As an American, where people say, or used to say anyway, that we had never lost a war or won a peace conference, I'm always sensitive to the possibility that once the bullets stop flying, one might start losing everything one had gained by the sacrifices. What worries me is that Russia is not only putting more troops in there, that's bad enough, but it's doing something else which is getting no attention. And that is that the Russians are subsidizing the return of ethnic Armenians from Armenia to the Stepanakert area. All of the returns, as far as I can see, that have happened because of Russian assistance. What that means is that Russia is trying to recreate an Artsakh republic at precisely the time that people are reading the November 10th declaration as putting an end to that. If I were in Baku, I would be very worried about the fact that we're not only seeing more Russian troops coming into the area, but we're seeing more ethnic Armenians brought back. I am absolutely certain, although I can't produce the evidence of this, but I'm certain that at least some of those people who are now, quote, returning, unquote, to the Stepanakert area are people who came into the Stepanakert area after 1995. That is to say, these are people who moved in to beef up the Armenian Artsakh Republic rather than being ethnic Armenians within Azerbaijan who had been there from time immemorial. I think that's something that is a real problem. And there's a third element here, which is also not getting much attention. On December 28th, a group of senior Armenian politicians announced plans for a movement to demand the creation that, or demand Armenia join the Russian-Belarusian Union State. Now, they don't have a majority in Yerevan or even a majority in the streets, and there are large numbers of Armenians who think that that kind of cooperation isn't in their interest. But I mention it because there's a tendency to think that after November 10th it was over, and that everybody would just do what they thought the others had promised to do. The Russians have taken everything that's in that document, and then they have every place that the document is open to interpretation, they have interpreted their way. That being the case, we're rapidly moving to a situation where something that looked very much like a victory in December may look like something else or later in January or in the coming months. And I think that the very celebratory approach to what happened in the Second Karabakh War, which was clearly a military victory by Azerbaijani forces, led some people in Azerbaijan to assume that everyone saw the situation the same way it did, that they saw it as an Azerbaijani victory now and forever. I think what in fact has happened has led to a situation where people in Moscow are saying, what do we have to do to change this in ways that will work for us? And those ways will, in many cases, not work to the benefit of Azerbaijan.
But what, in fact, is the benefit to Russia to have 500,000 Armenians resettling in Karabakh? What's the benefit to Russia?
Well, they haven't resettled anything like that number. I mean, not 500,000. We're talking.
Well, it's been reported 50,000. Sorry, 50,000.
They may get to 50,000. I don't believe they're there yet. Okay. For the simple reason, why was there no settlement of the Karabakh dispute for 30 years? Mm-hmm. For the simple reason that one of the co-chairs of the Minsk group had no interest in a settlement. Just because you're a member of a group that's supposedly seeking a peaceful solution doesn't mean that you are. Some countries benefited from that conflict and that tension. As long as there was tension between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Moscow had a much bigger voice over oil pipelines, highways, north-south and east-west transportation corridors. It had a lever it could use against both of those countries, both Armenia and Azerbaijan. It was able to present itself as a defender of Armenia for a lot of times, even when it was supposed to be neutral. It was in a position, therefore it got a lot of support from Armenia and Armenians that it wouldn't otherwise have gotten. So Russia benefited from having a conflict. A complete peace settlement in the South Caucasus is not something that Russia wanted or wants. Because as soon as that happens, if tomorrow, let's just imagine, fantasize, if tomorrow there were an agreement to recognize each other between Armenia and Azerbaijan, if the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan became a normal international border, if Azerbaijan and Armenia agreed on east-west transit across there, the biggest loser in that situation would be the Russian Federation, which would then no longer have the ability to play one off against the other as it has. And so what we're seeing is what one should expect, namely that Moscow is trying to not recreate the status quo ante entirely, but to establish conditions that resemble that status quo ante sufficient to make sure that having that kind of an outcome is not something that Moscow is going to have to face.
Thank you, Paul. That's really interesting. I do have a question about President Aliyev not voicing any problems concerning this the influx of Russian peacekeepers, the Armenians being resettled at a larger numbers where no Azeris are being settled or brought back to the region. Why is President Aliyev so silent on this?
Well, I think there are several possible reasons. I don't know the exact one, but let me suggest some of the possibilities. The first is that we are still in the immediate aftermath of what people thought was a settlement. And so there's going to be a lot of toing and froing, and there's a lot of uncertainty. As we've discussed already, no one has exact figures on the number of Russian troops there. No one has exact figures on the number of ethnic Armenians and who they are, who may have been returned to the area around Stepanakert. No one knows exactly how the transit corridors between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan or across Nakhichevan are going to work. And I think that the best explanation, or the explanation that would suggest the greatest sophistication on the part of President Aliyev, is that he doesn't want to intervene at his level before a little more time has elapsed and a little more clarity has been introduced. My guess is that at lower levels, these issues are being raised. But it's a very different thing for a deputy foreign minister or an ambassador to raise this than for the president of the country. It has different political meaning and a different weight. So my guess is that part of it is simply waiting and seeing how this shakes out, rather than saying something which could create a crisis. That's the first possibility. The second may be that President Aliyev doesn't believe that either of these things are going to ultimately work against him, that he believes that he's gotten enough out of this agreement that he can accept some of these as, just the cost of doing business, if you will. I personally think that one could argue against that view, but I can understand people who would want to think that Azerbaijan got a lot. I think people have not focused yet on just, they got 2/3 to 3/4 of what was under Armenian control back. They've gotten a transit route across something, so Azerbaijanis don't have to get Iranian visas to travel from Baku to Nakhichevan. I mean, those are very, very big things. And now, given the pincer movement of the Azerbaijani army, if Azerbaijan feels that it has to act again, there's no buffer zone anymore for Armenia. I mean, Armenians have said, and I think it's important to remember this, that had they not had the buffer zones that they created beyond Karabakh, that Azerbaijani forces would have been in Stepanakert. It was only that Azerbaijan had to take away the buffer zones. So from Baku's point of view, they're still doing pretty well. The problem is that they're in an environment where at least one of the parties is prepared to play dirty, if you will, and try to undercut what many of us hoped for.
There's much talk of a meeting in Moscow next week between President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan. What could be the possible positive outcomes from that?
Well, I would like to believe that it will open the door to large numbers of conversations at various levels. I think one of the important things that needs to happen in the South Caucasus is that the contacts between these governments have to stop being only at the presidential level. We need them at the ministerial level, ambassadorial level, at the business level, if you will. I think that our Vladimir Putin will try to use this to present himself as the great peacemaker, and that will have the effect of only limiting still further the willingness of Baku to challenge what Russia is doing. I would be thrilled if at the end of this meeting there could be an announcement that Armenia and Azerbaijan will begin ministerial consultations leading to the restoration of diplomatic recognition. I think it's critical that the end of this war be followed by something in that direction. And I think that if that can come out of that meeting, then it will be a very big deal, because that kind of bilateral accord would do more to solidify what Azerbaijan has achieved and to prevent Moscow from being able to undermine it than almost anything else.
So back to Russia again. The shooting down of the Russian helicopter on November 9th is back in the news again. Russian news agency says Russian investigators are now treating it as a willful, quote, willful murder, more serious than what they had originally called it, which was death through negligence. Hours after this happened on November 9th, Azerbaijan claimed responsibility and apologized for the incident. Why is Russia bringing this up now? What is it after?
I think it's exactly what you'd expect the Russian side to do. When you have a situation like this, you always bring it up when you want to keep the other side off balance. Clearly, this is sending a signal to President Aliyev that if you say anything about the fact that we've busted the limits on the number of Russian forces in the Karabakh region, we're going to create problems for you like this, and we're going to give you a black eye internationally. Azerbaijan played this conflict extremely well in terms of making a decision to end it when Azerbaijan decided to end it. Had it gone further, had it achieved the complete and total victory a lot of people in Baku would have liked, Azerbaijan would have found itself isolated internationally, because that would have resulted in the destruction or at least the internment of a large number of armed Armenians. And that's not something that I think the international community would be nearly as willing to accept as it has the agreement that we have. But that doesn't mean that this is over. This is going to go on for some time. And what the Russians have just done is one more way of signaling we can do this. And if Baku is cooperative, if Baku does what Moscow wants, we'll hear nothing about any trial on the basis of these new charges. If, on the other hand, Azerbaijan does something Moscow doesn't like, then I think it's almost certain that we'll hear lots more about this, even if no trial ever happens.
Interesting. How will the U.S., we're teetering now on a complete regime change in the U.S., or partial regime change in the United States. We're, depending on what time it is that you watch this. How will this affect Russia's power around the world? For example, even in Moldova, where the new president is calling for Russian troop removal, Russia now being involved in the Karabakh region and as peacekeepers. How will this change things?
Well, I think that you're going to have an administration in place, or you will already have it in place, again, depending on when you watch this, that is vastly more committed to the rule of international law than the current one. The Trump administration, like the Putin administration in Moscow, believes in a 19th century might makes right approach, that the big powers do what they want because they can, and that those smaller countries have to scurry about because the big countries make the decisions. That's certainly not the position that the Biden administration will be promoting. Joe Biden has been an internationalist committed to the rule of international law his entire career. So what you're going to see is a greater willingness on the part of the United States to speak up for the principles of international law than you do have in the Trump administration. And clearly, for example, the fact that there's been absolutely no comment from the Trump administration about Russian claims that it made the agreement with Turkey about troops in Azerbaijan would not be followed, I think, by the same kind of statement from a Biden administration, which would make very clear, as I tried to earlier, that this is an agreement, the agreement to have Turkish troops in Azerbaijan is an Azerbaijani agreement, and that the so-called agreement between Moscow and Ankara is only about the modalities of the cooperation of the two in a single monitoring center. That's a very, very different position. And to the extent that the United States takes that position, as I'm fairly confident it would in a Biden administration, that will limit Moscow's ability to cause trouble.
I have now a big picture question for you. Azerbaijan is generally not considered a bastion of democracy, according to a lot of the different measurements. Now that Azerbaijan has been recognized as a serious military force in the world, how important is it that this country deliver on universal freedoms and democratic values?
Well, I think that it all depends who's asking, who's the other side. If you're in a world where the dominant powers all believe that military strength is the only thing that matters, then you tend to overlook the way in which they treat their own people and how much they are committed to democratic norms. If you're in a world where there are leaders of major powers, the superpower of the United States, who believe that what really matters is how you treat your own people and whether government reflects the will of the people, then the reaction is going to be different. Again, I think one of the things we will have to see in the next couple of months is a Biden administration is going to be a lot more serious about the issues of democracy and human rights than the Trump administration was, and that therefore they will make demands or make suggestions or make critical remarks about the situation in Azerbaijan that the Trump administration didn't. There are two consequences of that. The first is that some in Azerbaijan will see that as the basis or making those kinds of positive changes, which I think all of us would like to see. A freer, more open, more democratic Azerbaijan ultimately works for the benefit of everyone in Azerbaijan. At the same time, the fact that there is at least one major power in the world, namely the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin, that doesn't care about democracy, that doesn't believe in human rights, that is prepared to murder its own citizens, that country is always going to be welcoming to someone that says military power is the only thing that matters. And so one of the issues, and it's going to be a big one in the coming months, is how much criticism is the United States going to make, given that Azerbaijan has somewhere to go? I make no secret that I would like to see a more open, free, and democratic Azerbaijan. But I also know that that has to be balanced against a situation where does that mean that Azerbaijan lines up with the Russian Federation on some issues when it might be more willing to line up with the United States and Western democracies if the criticism of its domestic policy was less intense. Those are the kinds of debates that I'm sure are going to take place in Washington in the coming weeks and months. And it's going to be the subject of the politics and geopolitics of the region for a very good long time.
What do you think it'll take? The Karabakh region really needs a great deal of rehabilitation, and it'll take upwards to $1 billion to rebuild that area. What will it take to include some international support? Where do you think this money might come from?
I think it's most likely to come from the European Union. I think the European Union is more committed to doing that kind of thing just now than is the United States. It's very difficult to say because we are hopefully this year entering into a post-pandemic world.
Yes.
And rebuilding every society after this pandemic is an enormously expensive thing. Nobody's been talking about the federal deficit in the United States, despite the fact that it was vastly greater this year, both absolutely and in real terms, than it's ever been in the history of the country, because we decided we needed to save people from disaster. But at some point, you're going to have to restrict that. You're going to have to bring the balance between income and outgo closer together, and that's going to make it difficult for more expansive activities. I think some countries like Germany and France are far more likely to get involved than we are. I would certainly urge us to get involved, but I don't expect it. The amount needed is just simply, I would put it at multiples of $1 billion. I think the problem is not simply rebuilding housing, it's rebuilding all the infrastructure. And that means the agricultural facilities, that means water supplies, that means roads, rail lines, so forth. And that's going to be a very difficult and long-term process. I very much hope the international community will recognize that this is something they need to do, but we know that there are many places in the world where there are disasters that are crying out for help and where help has not been provided. I mean, one of the reasons that Armenia was not in a position to absorb all the immigrants, all the people, Armenians who fled from the Karabakh area, was that the area that was devastated by the Spitak earthquake in the mid-'80s has still not been rebuilt. People there are still living in cardboard housing in some places. And so if that hasn't been rebuilt, which is a much less political thing than the Karabakh War, one can only imagine how hard it's going to be to address all of this. It should be done. Whether it will be, we'll see.
You've been involved in negotiating some kind of peace deal in this region for many years. Do you think the window for negotiating a serious peace deal is closed? There have been so many problems with this armistice. Is there still momentum to negotiate?
No, this is, as long as one understands that November 10th was a declaration and not a peace settlement, as long as one understands that November 10th was not a victory, an award of victory to Azerbaijan, but rather a registration of the latest milepost, if you will, on what is a very long road. Of course it's not closed. There are many very smart and clever people in Baku and in other capitals who need to start talking to one another. It's very much my hope that President Aliyev will promote that kind of exchange. Seeing that web of complex talks among people at all kinds of levels as vastly more important than the occasional summit meeting in Moscow. My fear is that Moscow is trying to promote these so-called summit meetings as a substitute for the negotiations that are really needed. And those negotiations need to be at the ministerial and sub-ministerial level, and also between the regions in Azerbaijan and regions in Armenia. All those things should be taking place. I believe that President Aliyev and his advisors understand that that's a process that they will benefit from. I believe they're not quite sure how anyone will react, given, why should we make concessions because we won on the ground? But what we're seeing with Russian behavior is the creation of a situation where a lot that Azerbaijan thought it had won might be lost unless more talks are held. No, I don't believe the window for talks is closed, and I think that it's critically important that President Aliyev and his government do everything they can to expand the talks rather than to allow anyone else, and Moscow in the first instance, to try to shut them down.
Well, Paul, we're at the beginning of a new year, and I want to wish you a happy new year. And if you can come up, do you have any idea what some of the challenges might be for Azerbaijan in 2021?
I think the biggest challenge is making sure that going forward, the conversation about Armenia and Azerbaijan is between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. That's first, so that it doesn't get hijacked by Moscow or the Minsk group. It's critical that it be about Azerbaijanis talking to Armenians. Otherwise, this is not going to go anywhere. Okay, that's the first. The second is to figure out how to navigate a situation where, on the one hand, the West will now have a leader much more concerned with human rights and democracy, and so that Azerbaijan can respond to that in a positive way, rather than deciding that the best solution is to get in bed with the Russians so that they don't have to make any change at all. That's going to be a source of tension in Baku throughout the year. A third is this: I don't think anyone knows what the post-pandemic world is going to be like, other than it's not going to be like the pre-pandemic world. And we don't know. I don't expect oil prices to come back. I mean, so that means a lot of Azerbaijanis' income isn't going to be there. I don't know what will happen now that Iran is further enriching uranium, and whether that will lead to a change in Western policy with respect to how to deal with Tehran on nuclear issues, but it certainly could. I don't know. I just think those are issues. They're not black swans because we can list them, but they are issues where the number of possible outcomes means that this isn't algebra. This isn't arithmetic, certainly, but it's not even algebra. There are so many unknowns that trying to guess where it will be 6 months or a year from now, I think is a waste of time, other than to the extent it leads us to think more deeply about what we might do.
Well, thank you for your insights, Paul. I hope your idea that the peace negotiations still have some possibility, that is a great hope for all of us. And Paul A. Goble, former special advisor on Soviet issues to U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, again, Happy New Year, and we hope to hear your great insights again soon. Thank you.
Happy New Year to you, and thank you very much for having me.
You bet.